Now that we had a thorough look at useState, useEffect, useReducer, we also used useCallback, let's have a look at how we can use the context API, which is also an exciting feature about React, together with functional components and hooks. And for that, I got my auth.js file, which we haven't used thus far, which is a very simple login form. Well, it doesn't even have inputs, but it has a login button at least, which we can click. And I want to show that if we're not logged in yet, and alternatively show my ingredients if we are logged in. That's where the app.js file will come into play. Right now, it always returns ingredients. The goal is that now this does not always return ingredients, but instead it returns either ingredients or the auth screen. So here in app.js, I'll import auth from ./components auth. And well, we could now always return auth, of course, which means we would always see this. But now we got no way of, well, going to our ingredients. So the goal will be that we switch between those. Now, of course, for that, we can manage all the auth logic here in app. You use an if statement to render different content. We could do that. But in a more complex app, of course, you might be interested in whether the user is authenticated or not in a couple of components, maybe deeply nested into other components. And therefore, passing data about the authentication status via props might not be what you want to do because you build very long chains of props which you have to pass around. That's where context can help us. For that, I'll create a new folder, context, which is optional, but I like to store my context in there, and name this auth-context.js. This is the file name in there. Now in this auth-context file, we can create context by importing React from React. And then we create our, let's say, auth-context. Name is totally up to you, but should start with a capital character actually, by calling React create context. And this is also something I covered earlier in the course already. This is the context API offered by React. So go back to that component deep dive section if you're not entirely sure what this means. Now we can initialize this with a value, and there I want to manage whether we're authenticated or not. And I want to provide a login function, which here is just an empty function, but which I still add here to get better autocompletion. We'll override this with a concrete value soon. I will also export this context object, but I will also use it in that same file to create a component there. I'll name the component auth-context-provider. It's a normal React component, a functional component as you can tell. And in there, I return auth-context.provider. So I'm using auth-context up there, and this automatically is a valid React component, or at least with .provider, it gives you a valid React component. And between there, I want to allow anything. So I'll add props children there so that we can use the auth-context provider, pass anything as a child to it, and it will be wrapped by our context. Now it's in here where I want to manage that login status. And I'll do this with the help of useState now. useState because it's a really simple state. It's a simple state because I only want to track whether the user is authenticated, and I want to be able to set is authenticated or not. And initially the user is not authenticated, which is why I initialize this with a false value. Now I'll also add a function here, log user in or whatever you want to name it, or log in handler. Name is totally up to you. This takes no arguments here because it's just about showing how to work with context, not about really taking inputs here and validating that. And then I'll call set is authenticated and set this to true. That's what I do here. Very trivial function. Now the auth-context provider gets a value which will automatically be distributed to everyone listening if it changes, which describes our context. Initially we have this starting value, but now I will immediately override it with a new object where I have login. And that's my login handler pointing at this function. So now we have a real function behind it. And is auth, where we have is authenticated, so this state value. And again, if this changes, so for example, if we call set is authenticated, everyone listening will get this updated value. So now we just need to export, maybe as a default, this auth-context provider, so this component which we built here. And now I have this default export, and here we have a named export. And now we can use that, and we can use it in the index.js file, so the root of our application. There we can import the off context provider from .context, ./context, off context, and wrap our entire app with it. So wrap the entire app with off context provider like this, so that the entire app receives our context or is able to receive it. You can listen to the context from everywhere in the app. That's the right way of putting it. So off context provider is wrapped around our app. In app.js, I'm already interested in it. And that's the thing which could be problematic with functional props. We can, of course, import our off context, so not the provider component, but the context object itself, from ./context off context. However, here I mean the named export, so we have to wrap this in curly braces. And what we can do is we can wrap this here with offContext.consumer now to set up this render function in the end in there. This would be how you can use context in functional components. This means that if you need data from the context anywhere else but in your JSX tree, you have no way of getting it. You would need to transform this into a class-based component so that you can add the static context type thing, which you might remember from earlier in the course. Well, thankfully, there is a hook to also fix this. The useContext hook. You use it like this. You pass in the context you want to listen to, so to say, off context in my case, and you get a handle to that context, which is then stored in this constant. And you can name it whatever you want. Here I name it off context. And now here in app.js, I can listen to off context.isOff, or not listen to it, but check it, and this will be rebuilt whenever the context changes, whenever the value in there changes. So whenever we change isOff, for example, then this will rebuild. So here I listen to it, and then I want to output a different content. Let's say my default content here is the off component like this. But if we are authenticated, then content, of course, is the ingredients component. And then down there, instead of hard coding context, I return content, which is changed depending on the value in context. Now we just need to make sure that clicking on the login button also does reach the, login handler function here. Keep in mind that a pointer at this function is stored in login in the context. So all I have to do is I have to go to the place where the button is, which is in the off component, and also import the off context there, off context, the named import, from the context folder off-context, and import the use context hook here as well. And now here, I can get access to my off context with use context pointing at off context. And in the login handler, I'll call off context.login as a function. And now with that, if we click that button, we're logged in and we see the ingredients. So this is how we can work with context with functional components and the use context hook.